In today's video for CoinPoker.com, we're going to be looking at not one, not two, but three wild hands that were played from the recent Cash Game World Championship. Let's get right to it. In the CoinPoker Cash Game World Championship, they played 50, 100, no limit Texas Hold'em with no ante and no rake, which does result in this game playing a little bit looser than a typical online cash game where there is a rake. In this hand, Flushie raises it up to 2 big blinds out of his 150 big blind stack, about $15,000. And then LLinusLLove, one of the absolute top cash game players in the world, maybe the top, 3-bets to 700 or 7 big blinds from the button. Everyone folds back around to Flushie, who calls. So far, so good. Standard poker. The flop comes Jack of clubs, 9 of hearts, 8 of spades. Flushie checks, and then LLinusLLove checks behind. This is a situation a lot of people mess up. They think that when they 3-bet or re-raise before the flop, that they should continuation bet pretty much every flop because they have aces, kings, queens, jacks, etc. in their range. However, this board in particular, Jack 9-8, is very bad for the pre-flop 3-better because the pre-flop raiser who called the 3-bet is going to have a lot of hands like pocket jacks, pocket nines, pocket eights, ace jack, king jack suited, queen jack suited, stuff like that. So this is a situation where when the 3-better is checked to, they should only continuation bet about 17% of the time, very infrequently. And when they do bet, they want to bet small. This is simply because they don't have much of a range and or nut advantage in this situation, resulting in them having to check a ton. Always consider how your entire range interacts with your opponent's entire range. And in this spot, the in position pre-flop 3-better has a lot of very medium strength hands like middle pair, bottom pair, ace high, under pairs that really just don't want to put in a lot of money. So they check it back a lot. And queen 9 suited, which is what Linus has, checks it back almost every single time. The turn is the 3 of diamonds, a total brick, and Flushie now bets $2,325, about 1.5x pot. Let me say, why in the world would you do this? Especially given I just told you Linus should be checking it back with hands like overpairs and whatnot. Well, this is a spot where essentially Flushie is really pushing their super nut advantage with hands like pocket jacks, pocket nines, pocket eights, 9-8 suited, queen 10 suited, and this allows them to use a very, very big bet with their best made hands, like the super nut hands, as well as draws. And in this situation, draws are going to be hands like 7-6 suited, which is what Flushie has, ace queen, king queen, ace 10, king 10, etc. So this is an excellent spot for Flushie to blast it. Facing a turn overbet is always a difficult spot when your opponent structures their range well, where they are betting with very good made hands and draws. And this is a spot where ace jack, top pair, top kicker, actually mixes between calling and folding in Linus's shoes. Same thing for king jack, whereas hands containing a queen or a 10 with a pair, such as Linus's queen 9, opts to call every single time. And that's because they have additional equity. Whenever your opponent's betting using an overbet size, assuming they're playing well, as Flushie certainly is, you have to make sure that you have outs against their very strong made hands like sets in this situation, right? So for that reason, hands like ace jack do a ton of folding. Now, of course, if Flushie is overbetting the turn far too often, then don't go around folding top pair. But if your opponent is perhaps on the tighter side with their overbets, where they don't bluff quite enough, and their range becomes very set and straight heavy, hands like ace jack and king jack need to hit the muck immediately. Queen 9 suited calls every time though, as Linus does. On the 4 of clubs river, you may be surprised to know the only bet size that is used for the most part in Flushie's situation is all in, 2x pot. That's because when they blast the turn, they're already saying they're very polarized to really good made hands and nothing, right? So when they get to the river and nothing changes, they have really good made hands or nothing. So this is a spot where pretty much all of the very strong hands like sets and straights and 2 pair are going all in the majority of the time, although they do check every once in a while to protect their checking range. And 7-6, given it has literally no showdown value whatsoever, is an excellent bluffing candidate. And Flushie finds it. Very, very, very nice all in this situation. In GTO world, queen 9 of diamonds mixes between calling and folding, although it does mostly fold. Hands like pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens also mix between calls and folds because you have to realize when Flushie does make this giant overbet with a perfectly polarized range, all of your bluff catchers become pretty close to indifferent. Now, Linus called the queen nine of diamonds, which is a hand that often errs towards folding. So the question becomes then, why would Linus want to call a hand that often errs towards folding? And in this situation, if Flushie bluffs the river with all busted draws, such as ace queen, king queen, and ace 10, well then now Flushie is going to be bluffing the river far too often. And I do think players who are good at hitting reasonable frequencies on the turn with value bets and bluffs for that 1.5x pot overbet in Flushie shoes, they get to the river with a lot of hands that simply are not going to win at the showdown very often, like ace 10, king 10, king queen, etc. And they bluff every single one of those. And if they bluff all of those, queen nine of diamonds becomes a super easy call. Linus finds the call this time and scoops a massive pot. Let's get to the next hand. Everyone folds to Davey on the button, who makes it $250, 2.5 big blinds out of his $11,000 effective stack, and then Matt calls in the big blind. Flop comes queen of clubs, 8 of hearts, 7 of diamonds. The big blind's going to check pretty much every time. And then on the button, Davey should continuation bet very often in this spot, about 2/3 of the time, usually using a small bet. He goes $165 and then faces a check raise. Pretty big. To 700, this is an excellent hand to check raise in this situation because it's an open-ended straight draw that lacks showdown value and can get a whole lot of better hands to fold. If he had 9-6 of spades without the backdoor flush draw, he should usually prefer to just call, but with the backdoor flush draw and the straight draw, you're gonna wanna check raise very, very often, which is what he does. Back around to Davey with the king 8, super easy call. You can't go around folding middle pair. Let's head to the turn. The turn is a 2 of spades, and then Matt goes for a bit more than the size of the pot, about $2,300. When you check raise the flop in Matt's shoes, you're gonna have all your very, very strong hands, of course, but in terms of bluffs, you're gonna have some backdoor flush draws and a bunch of straight draws. When the turn does not bring in any of the backdoor flush draws, like on this 2 of spades, meaning there's one card of each suit on the board, a badoogie, you usually want to continue betting with the vast majority of your straight draws. If instead the turn was something like a 2 of diamonds, then some of your straight draws would then opt to check more often because you would have some backdoor flush draws that could easily continue betting that have a whole lot of equity. When the turn is a badoogie though, that's a complete brick pretty much, you are going to want to continue betting using a polarized size with a lot of your straight draws, which is exactly what Matt does. He does go for a bit more than the size of the pot. This is an excellent play. If he did have one of those backdoor flush draws, let's say king 5 of diamonds, he should be way more inclined to just check and give up in this spot, which feels a little bad, but that's very often what you want to do when you're check raising a lot of draws on the flop. You get to keep betting the ones that have decent equity on the turn, and the ones that go to complete garbage, well, you're probably going to be check folding on the turn. Anyway, now, Davey has an interesting decision with his very clear bluff catcher second pair. This is a spot where when you are facing this bet, you want to call when your kicker does not interact with your opponent's bluffs. So, using some logic here, which hands should Matt be bluffing with? Well, I just said a lot of open-ended straight draws, right? So in this scenario, Davey does not especially want to have a jack, a 10, a 9, or a 6 or a 5 in his hand to continue in this situation. And he especially does not want to have a jack 10 or 9. So in this situation, ace 8 and king 8 call pretty much every single time, whereas jack 8 and 10 8 and 9 8 do a whole lot of folding. So in this situation, you always want to consider how your kicker interacts with your opponent's bluffs. If you block the bluffs, making it more likely they have a strong made hand, you should start to fold out your bluff catchers. But if you do not block their bluffs, meaning it's more likely they have a bluff, you want to be calling with your bluff catchers. So king 8 in this spot is a wonderful hand to call with. Let's go to the river. The river 4 of spades may look like a blank, but it's definitely not, because a lot of Matt's bluffs on the turn are going to be 6-5 suited, which just made the nuts. So when you are already polarized on the turn, betting your very strong made hands and draws, and the river doesn't really improve that many of your opponent's hands, meaning your turn strong hands like top 2 pair are still really, really good, and some of your draws get there, you get to bet the river pretty often. And because you are polarized, you're gonna want to bet huge, which is all in. So in this spot, Matt should be ripping it in with something like 2 pair and better for value. Perhaps they can get away with going all in with the ace queen or queen jack suited if they felt inclined, and they get to have a lot of bluffs. Now, the question is, how many bluffs do you get to have? And a lot of people overdo it in this spot. While 9-6 certainly rips it in every single time, if you shove hands like jack 10 suited, you're probably gonna end up bluffing a little bit too often. So this is a spot where 9-6 suited certainly gets the shove, but again, you have to be careful when you do still have a lot of missed draws getting to the river that you don't overdo it. When you have what is again a bluff catcher on the river, a hand that loses to all value hands but beats all bluffs like second pair, you really do not want to block your opponent's bluffs. And in this situation, the vast majority of Matt's bluffs do not have a hand containing a king. So for that reason, King 8 is going to call a decent amount of the time in this spot. And Matt does, and scoops a massive pot. Let's take a look at one more fun cash game hand for you. Near the very end of this cash game world championship, two players were at the top of the leaderboard, Prodigy and Rigged Deck. And in this hand, they battle it out, playing 200 big blinds deep. Rigged Deck makes it $250 on the button with pocket eights with the 8 of clubs. And then Prodigy in the small blind makes it $1,300 with ace queen with the queen of clubs. These clubs are going to matter. Rigged Deck calls, the flop comes ace 6 2 all clubs. Prodigy continuation bets tiny $300, which is roughly the GTO size in this situation. Because in spots like this, if you have a flush, you pretty much have the super nuts, your opponent is drawing thin or dead, and you really want to keep them in the pot. Plus, Prodigy in this spot is going to have a lot of decent aces that are also very likely good. Plus, even pocket pairs are pretty decent in this spot. So this is a situation where Prodigy should be betting pretty frequently using a small size. Then Rigged Deck with the pocket eights raises it up to about $1,200. In GTO world, this raise is a little bit big. You're probably going to go just a touch smaller. And also in GTO world, pocket eights does not raise much at all. It actually calls pretty much every time, whether or not you have a club. But perhaps Rigged Deck is playing some sort of exploitative strategy where he's getting in there and battling and just applying a lot of pressure to all of his opponents, and maybe, just maybe, people overfold in poker. Who'd have thought? Rigged Deck does raise it up with the pocket eights. Prodigy with the ace and queen does not want to re-raise with anything. When you bet the flop small and your opponent raises, like in the previous two hands, they're essentially saying they are already polarized to good made hands and draws. In this spot, draws are gonna be stuff like pairs with some additional equity. But in the spot, if you are against a flush already, you're not loving it. So for that reason, you don't re-raise anything. Ace queen with or without a club calls. The turn is the jack of hearts. Ace queen checks, and then the pocket ace goes for a 2/3 pot size bet. While this is a very good bet size in this situation, the pocket ace is not a particularly great candidate to do this with, and you should probably just check it back if you did raise the flop with the pocket eights, because it's a very clear medium strength hand. And if you do bet in the spot, you need your opponent to be folding out a lot of hands containing an ace. Now, some people will, some people won't. But I think if anything, a lot of the best cash game players are kind of sticky and kind of battly. And for that reason, I don't think you're gonna get overfolds on the turn compared to the GTO strategy. Now, if you think your opponent's gonna fold far too often with hands like ace queen or any other ace, well then maybe going for the bluff is fine. But in GTO world, the pocket eight should just check it back. Ace queen with the queen of clubs, of course, has a super duper easy call. You don't want to raise at this point, because if you raise and a lot of money goes in, you're going to be drawing to a flush, which is not where you want to be. So with both a decent top pair and the flush draw, call and head to the river. The river is the 5 of spades. Ace queen, of course, checks for Prodigy. Rigged Deck then rips it all in. Again, in GTO world, this is probably a pretty big mistake to shove in this situation. If you opt to check it back, you're going to realize something like 4.8 big blinds or so out of the pot, which is a lot. And if you shove all in, you're going to lose something like 7.5 big blinds on average, which is also a lot. In general, when you have a very clear medium strength hand on the river that can beat some of your opponent's hands, checking it back is usually a pretty good idea. That said, if Rigged Deck thinks Prodigy is going to drastically overfold, perhaps they think Prodigy is going to fold out all sorts of hands like pocket tens with a 10 of clubs every time, or ace queen every time, well then the shove becomes very reasonable, right? So when you are in a scenario on the river and you're considering a bluff, of course always consider what the GTO strategy looks like, but also consider, will my opponent overcall or overfold compared to GTO. And if they're going to drastically overfold, you can take a lot of hands that have only a little bit of showdown value, like these pocket eights, and rip them all in. Ace with the queen of clubs for Prodigy opts to find the call and scoops a massive pot. Would you believe, though, that if and only if, riggedeck is playing perfect GTO poker, ace with the queen of clubs is basically a break-even call. Pretty wild, right? When people use polarized ranges and sizes on the turn and river and they're using big overbets, you need to make sure you are folding a lot. That said, I would have called the ace with the queen of clubs. Seems like a very logical hand, especially if your opponent's going to overbluff at all. Prodigy finds the call and wins the pot along with the CoinPoker Cash Game World Championship. That is it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. Click the notification bell. Good luck in your games. Have fun, and I'll talk to you next time.